Hi, guys. I want to finish our lecture today over cities and urban land use. And remember, this doesn't include any of the city models. I'm just focusing on the basics of cities and urban land use. Today, I want to discuss gentrification and a few other items, but gentrification will be the bulk of what I discuss today. So, you may have heard the term gentrification before. It's something that definitely there are two sides to this. It's highly controversial. It stirs a lot of passions in people, and we'll discuss the reason for that. But let me give you an overview of what gentrification is. It's basically when you have an area that's lower socioeconomic region. So you have a lot of people that are either close to poverty level or maybe below poverty level or in poverty level. And so their housing reflects it because if you're only making poverty level in this country, I think is about $26,000 per year. If you're making $26,000 a year, you're not going to have the ability to be able to make improvements to your house and pay your taxes and feed your family and do all those things. So oftentimes in these areas where gentrification is beginning to occur, it's property that's valuable because it's going to be closer to the CBD, closer to the city center, but it's going to be run down. And so what happens is you have people that have money, and I want you to kind of think about if you've had the chance to watch House Hunters or any of those shows on HGTV, you see gentrification happening a lot actually on House Hunters. But people come in, and these are middle-class people, of all ethnic backgrounds, but they come in and they see a property and they're like, wow, this property is really undervalued. I think I want to make an offer and see if I could buy this property from somebody, and I want to renovate it. And so that's exactly what happens is you have people with money coming into these areas that are highly undervalued, and they make renovations to it. So there are some positives and negatives to this, which I want to discuss. And then I want to go ahead and use an example in Houston of the ward system. So let me skip over the ward system first. So whenever you're looking at this from an AP Human point of view, keep in mind that gentrification is a great fostering site, really, really great rich material here for FRQs. And actually, you've seen this before on FRQs for AP Human Geography. It would really fit well for a compare and contrast type of model for an FRQ. And it wouldn't necessarily say compare and contrast. It would say, what are the benefits of gentrification or what are the negatives of gentrification? And so I suggest in your notes, go ahead and set up this T-chart where you can look at the benefits of gentrification and then the negative aspect of gentrification. So for instance, let's start with the negatives first. The negatives of gentrification are what happens when people come in and they, knock down old housing and then they build new housing. Is it increases the property value of the surrounding area. So if someone were to, let's say in my neighborhood, knock down a house or two and then build a huge, set of condos, it would increase the value of everyone surrounding those condos, not just the area where the condos are being built. And so what ends up happening is property taxes, especially in a state like Texas, can be pretty steep. And so if suddenly your property taxes go from $1,000 a year to maybe $5,000 or $6,000 a year because your property values have doubled or tripled or quadrupled, you can't afford to pay those taxes anymore, especially if you're living at or below the poverty line. Another thing that happens, because this does end up pushing out the poor, is it ends up destroying the culture of a region. And once again, we'll go back and we'll talk about the ward system at Houston in just a minute. The last thing is that it creates this sense of placelessness, which we've talked about placelessness before. This is this thought that you're beginning to see pockets in area that are either suburbanized or maybe that are gentrifying, that there's not this original culture there anymore. Everything kind of looks exactly the same, has the same architecture, has the same stores. Oh, there's a Starbucks down the street, or there's a Chipotle down the street. There's no original, where's my barbecue restaurant or where's my, independent coffee house. All that stuff is gone. So those are the negatives. The benefits of gentrification, and I guess the positives of gentrification are quite a few. The first thing is it tends to get rid of urban blight. So it, in a lot of these gentrified areas, you have a lot of heavy crime, heavy drug use. And so by knocking down these old abandoned buildings, some of them are abandoned, you tend to see blight reduced because now you have these brand new buildings in its place. Now, they look like all the other buildings, but you're getting rid of some of those aspects of crime. It does increase property values, and by increasing property values, it increases that tax base for the local taxing authority. So, to a certain extent, by providing more income to the local regions, you are able to help the poor in those regions because more services are being provided for them. It does tend to provide a windfall for the poor, and by windfall I mean you're able to, if people have to sell their homes because they can't afford to pay property taxes, at the very least they're going to be getting some money, some value for the property that they do have. And of course, finally, there's this reduction in crime that you do tend to see in these areas that are gentrified. Okay, so now I want to go back to discussing the third ward. Third ward, or actually all of the ward system in Houston. There are many different wards in Houston, and these are remnants from actually even before the Civil War, but they became really well known after the Civil War, and one of them in particular is really well known, and of course the toponym of this particular ward is called Freedmen's Town. So you can imagine the connection there just by thinking about the toponym of Freedmen's Town, the type of ethnic group that you would see. And of course, these are heavily African American ward systems there. So in the wards in Houston, you're beginning to see this fight over, and it's exactly playing out kind of that T-chart that I showed you of what happens to culture in a region when gentrification occurs. And I went ahead and I pulled these images from this article that I linked on the PowerPoint from the Houston Chronicle. And really and truly, if you were to Google Houston gentrification, there are tons of articles out there about what you're seeing with regards to destruction of culture in Houston. And these are old African American communities that are just being knocked down. And you can see in the background of this particular one, the little condos or maybe apartments that are popping up, and then some of the older houses, the older housing styles, and this one as well, and then the bigger houses there. So just kind of something to keep in mind with regards to this. The city, I think, is, from what I've been reading, is doing a better job managing this. But, this is kind of some of the problems with regards to gentrification in any region is it's really hard to stop. I don't want to call it progress because I don't know if it's necessarily call it progress, but it's hard to stop this force of gentrification because honestly, guys, this is something that happens everywhere. I spent a couple of weeks last summer in Rome, and in Rome, you just see layer upon layer of civilization. And I think gentrification is just simply a version of that happening where you see over time, people knock down houses and they build new houses, they knock down buildings and build new buildings. This is a force that humanity just tends to do, but we do see it, and we label it gentrification in this country, but this is something that just continues to happen regardless of, I guess, time and place would be the best way to put that. So when you're looking at this from an FRQ point of view, just make sure that you remember whenever you're doing something that's kind of a compare and contrast type FRQ, that you don't say something along the lines of, gentrification increases property values, but I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. You just need to make sure that you always balance the equation whenever you're doing a compare and contrast type FRQ. Okay. All right, so a couple more items that I want to discuss with you are the concepts of redlining, food deserts, and filtering. Food deserts we've discussed before in our ag unit. And if you recall, these are regions in urban areas that it's a struggle for people to find fresh food within a mile. So basically within an average walking distance. And even though we tend to think of this as something that you just see in inner cities, where I live out in suburbia in Houston, I know for the longest time, the place where we've lived here for quite a while. And when we first moved out here, there was hardly any development. And for me personally, it took me about 30 minutes to try and get to the grocery store. So going to the grocery store was not something that I did frequently just because it was such a hassle to go because it was such a long distance. And this was driving. This was not walking time. This is driving time. So, but in inner cities, you do see this. And this is part of the reason why you do tend to see higher levels of things like obesity and heart disease and diabetes, because unfortunately the access to fresh, nutritious foods is a problem. And now, luckily, there is a response to this, and we did discuss this in our ag unit about local food movements, and especially like inner city urban gardening. So we need to go back to our ag unit for that. Redlining is something that we did discuss back in our culture and ethnicity unit. But just to kind of revisit this, this is when you have an area, typically in an inner city area, typically an ethnic inner city area, where banks have made the decision. Of course, once again, this is highly illegal. So let's kind of revisit this and what we learned about this. This is a practice that's really, really illegal, where banks were basically, they had a map in front of them and they said, okay, this is where this particular ethnic group lives. We don't want to give any home loans to this particular region because we're concerned that it's a high poverty rate and they won't pay back loans and that kind of stuff. And of course, as we know, you can get sued into the ground for this kind of stuff. So redlining is just not something that, well, if it is occurring, I'm sure banks will find themselves at the receiving end of a lawsuit. And then the last thing I want to discuss is filtering. Filtering is a process where you have a home, maybe it was a larger home, or maybe it was a single family home that's been sold and that's been carved into smaller units. So instead of a single family home that can hold a family of 5 or 6 or whatever, now it's going to be a home. Maybe every single level might be converted for a different family. So instead of a single family home, maybe you have 5 or 6 families that are living there. And this is something that you do tend to see in urban areas as well. Okay, so a few more vocabulary terms I want to go over with you that you'll see this every now and again when you're looking at this particular unit. Is this a thought of high density housing, medium density housing, and low density housing? And you can see from the images here, once you understand the visual of what these mean, they're pretty easy to understand. So in a CBD area, you're going to see high density housing like what you see below. This is where you're building up. You have a lot of people living in a small footprint because the land is super expensive. And so the people who develop that site want to get as much money as they can to afford to pay for the property. And so that's why they build up. Medium density housing you can find in central, in closer to a CBD, or maybe like halfway between a CBD and a suburb, or you could see this in suburbia as well. Medium density housing is going to be something along the lines of multifamily units like apartments or condos. So once again, you're going to have a parcel of land, but the people who develop it want to get as much money as they possibly can to pay for it. And so that's why they have that medium density housing. And then finally, low density housing, it's just simply a home. Okay. What we tend to think of as a home, you tend to have maybe a family there, like a nuclear family there, which is going to be, parent and children, or maybe an extended family where you might have grandparents living there as well. That's also called a multi-generational family. So anyway, those are the different housing types that you tend to see. And I just wanted to make sure that you were familiar with those terms. So what makes a city a city? Oftentimes you'll hear people talk about, the city of what, in this case, the city of Houston. And so those of us that live in and around the city of Houston, we know that like where I live outside the Houston city limits. So the little green that's surrounding on this slide that I have here, that's going to be one of the beltways that surrounds Houston, and that's inside the Houston city limits. So Houston proper, inside the Houston city limits, we have about 2.5 million people living there. But outside the Houston city limits, in what's called the Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, the MSA is basically the functional region surrounding the city. Okay, so that movement that goes back and forth. A lot of my students, their parents commute into downtown area or maybe the oil corridor on the west side of town. But it's this functional region, this movement that surrounds the city. You have your node, which is downtown or maybe the oil corridor, Galleria area. And then you have movement back and forth from the suburbia to that particular region. So just realize in Houston, We have about 6.5 million people that live outside of Houston city limits, but that are directly affected or maybe work in the region of the Houston area. And most major metropolitan areas are exactly that way. And as a matter of fact, the government has set up, if you were to Google United States MSAs, you could see the difference in looking at a city like New York proper, so within the limits of New York versus the MSA, the functional region of New York City. So I highly suggest you check that out. And I also kind of wanted to show you just how large Houston is, because I don't think people realize the size of Houston, the scale of Houston. Houston is a city that is actually, and this doesn't even include all of Houston, because I live in the area outside of that drawing of Rhode Island there. And I don't think people realize how large Houston is. Okay, it's a very, very large city. The functional region is quite large. And like I said before, it's larger than some states. So one more thing I want to talk about before we're done today is I want to discuss the Boswash corridor. This is a term that you guys do need to know. A megalopolis is a region that has you have these areas that continue to grow together. So different cities, and they continue to grow together over time. So maybe from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C. is our Boswash area. And over time, these regions basically have become so densely populated that from Washington, D.C. to Boston, it's just this filling in of space of humanity. And so in the United States, this is going to be one of the largest, actually in North America, the largest megalopolis region. It has about 17% of the country's total population, but it only has about less than 2% of the total area of the country, which it ends up being about 53 million inhabitants. So when we're talking about coronavirus and the regions that are being heavily affected by it, if you look at that New York City area and kind of the surrounding areas, especially New Jersey, they've all been heavily, and really up into Connecticut, they've all been heavily affected because that functional region surrounding New York City and kind of down the eastern seaboard there. Okay, I know I said that was my last slide, but this really, really is my last slide because I remembered I wanted to make sure I went over bid rent theory with you. So bid rent theory, we saw this first in our ag unit, if you recall, discussing von Thunen. And you could see here the rings at the bottom should kind of remind you of von Thunen. But bid rent theory is this thought, and you guys know this. I know you know this. This is just another example of in this class how you know these concepts, but once we put the terminology to the concept that you know, kids tend to get a little confused, but I don't want you to be confused about this because this is just common sense. What bid rent theory says is that people and users will compete for land closest to the CBD or the city center. And that land is more expensive the closer that you get into the city center, the closer that you get into the CBD. And that the further away from the CBD that you want to utilize land or live, the cheaper it gets. Okay. And so applying concepts of this, you tend to see services and business closer to the CBD that can actually afford those rents. And further away from the CBD, these are going to be services and businesses and housing that people feel comfortable spending for that particular land use. Okay. So the best way for you guys to take a look at this and to practice this is I want you to go to the Houston Association of Realtors and I want you to look up the zip codes 77433. This is in a suburban area outside of Houston, kind of in the far, far northwest part of the Houston, Harris County area. And then I want you to look up 77019. This is one of the poshest areas in Houston. This is old money, the River Oaks area, old money, been around for forever. And I want you to basically kind of scroll through the houses and find a house that's maybe about 2,000 square feet, maybe about 3,000 square feet, and then compare the price per square foot. So price per square foot is really easy to calculate. It's the total value of the house divided by the square feet. Okay. And go ahead and compare these two items because I want you to see just how different these two zip codes are with regards to value or price per square foot. And that will show you very, very clearly, I think, the concept of bid rent, because those houses that are in 77019, that River Oaks area, Guys, it's really, really close to downtown Houston, the whole River Oaks area, and some other areas, kind of close to Rice University, not too close, but kind of close to Rice University and the medical center. So that's just a really good way for you to practice bid rent theory and to kind of think about land use. So I hope this helped you guys, and I want you all to have a really great afternoon.